I lives in a society where cultural norms restrict women's freedom and opportunities. I questions these and decides to challenge them, facing resistance and obstacles along the way. Before we kick off, I just want to say thanks to each of you for joining me on this wild ride. If you're vibing with these empowerment stories, hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it helps us grow this awesome community. Now let's get into it. I suppose every story of change begins with a moment of recognition. That instant when you realize the world you've always known isn't the world you want to live in. Mine came on a Tuesday morning in September, standing in my mother's kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, watching my younger brother Thomas pack his university acceptance letter into his rucksack with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to dream. The morning light filtered through our cottage windows, casting everything in that golden hue that makes our village look like something from a postcard. Millhaven has always been beautiful in that achingly perfect way. Thatched roofs and stone walls weathered smooth by centuries, gardens blooming with hollyhocks and roses, the gentle curve of the River Tess winding through fields so green they hurt your eyes. Tourists come here seeking the authentic English countryside experience, and we give it to them. Cream teas and Morris dancing, church bells and pub quizzes. What they don't see, what most of us have learned not to see, are the invisible walls that divide this pretty picture into separate worlds. I was 22 that morning, with a degree in literature from the local college, and hands that smelled perpetually of flour from helping mother with her baking orders. Thomas was 19, loud and gangly, and utterly certain that the world owed him everything he wanted. The unfairness of it sat in my chest like a stone. "You'll write, won't you?" Mother was saying to him, pressing a packet of biscuits into his bag. "Every week, mind you. Your father and I will worry ourselves sick otherwise." "Course I will," Thomas replied, though we all knew he wouldn't. Boys weren't expected to keep the home fires burning with their letters and phone calls. That was women's work, like most things that mattered, but earned no recognition. Father looked up from his newspaper, always the same ritual, tea and toast, and the morning headlines consumed in precise order. "Make us proud, son," he said, and there was something in his voice I recognized but couldn't name. Pride, yes, but also a kind of relief. Thomas was doing what he was supposed to do, leaving, conquering, becoming something more than what he'd been born to. "What about you, Rebecca?" Thomas asked suddenly, shouldering his bag. "Still helping with the baking?" The question was innocent enough, but it landed like a slap. Still helping with the baking, as if that was all I was, all I could ever be. The girl who helped, who stayed, who made herself useful in small, forgettable ways. "Someone has to," I said, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I'd applied to 3 universities the year before, quietly, secretly, using the computer at the library, and been accepted to 2. The whole truth was that when I'd shown Father the acceptance letters, he'd looked at me as if I'd suggested running naked through the village square. "University?" he'd said, the words sitting strangely in his mouth. "Whatever for?" "You've got a good head for numbers and your mother's gift for baking. That's more than most girls need." More than most girls need. The phrase had echoed in my head for months afterward, growing heavier each time I heard it. Because I wasn't most girls, was I? I was me, Rebecca Hartwell, and I needed more than flour-dusted hands and small, safe dreams. After Thomas left that morning, trailing promises and excitement like ribbons behind him, the cottage felt different. Smaller. Mother busied herself with the washing up, humming tunelessly as she always did when she was upset. Father had gone to his workshop, where he'd spend the day crafting furniture for people who could afford custom-made pieces. Good work, honest work, work that let him use his hands and his skill and his mind. I stood in the kitchen, holding that cold cup of tea, and felt something crack open inside my chest. It wasn't anger, exactly, though anger was part of it. It was recognition, the sudden, crystalline understanding that this kitchen, this village, This life I'd been handed like an inheritance. None of it was inevitable. It was all just choices, made by other people, other generations, and accepted as truth simply because they'd gone unquestioned for so long. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Patterson hanging washing on the line, her movements efficient and practiced. Beyond her, old Mr. Jenkins was tending his garden, coaxing late-season vegetables from the soil. Normal people living normal lives in our beautiful, suffocating village. How many of them had ever asked why things were the way they were? How many had simply accepted their small piece of the world and called it enough? That afternoon, I walked to the village hall where the monthly council meeting was being held. I'd never attended before. Women rarely did, unless they were there to serve tea or take notes. But something had shifted in me that morning, watching Thomas pack his future into a rucksack, and I couldn't seem to stop walking. The hall was full of familiar faces, farmers and shopkeepers, the vicar and the doctor, all the men who made the decisions that shaped our community. They looked up when I entered, surprise flickering across their expressions like sunlight on water. "Ah, Rebecca," said Mr. Whitmore, the village elder, his voice carrying that particular tone men use when they're being kind to children and women. "Have you come to help with the refreshments?" "No," I said, the word falling into the room like a stone into still water. "I've come to listen." The silence that followed lasted only a moment, but it felt like an eternity. I could see the men exchanging glances, uncertain how to respond to this small rebellion. Someone laughed, a nervous sound that didn't quite cover the discomfort in the room. "Well then," Mr. Whitmore said finally, "I suppose there's no harm in that." But there was harm in it, wasn't there? Harm to the careful order of things, to the unspoken rules that kept everyone in their proper place. I took a seat in the back row and folded my hands in my lap, trying to look smaller than I felt. But inside, something had already begun to grow. A quiet, dangerous certainty that I had as much right to be in that room as any of them. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of a world that seemed determined to keep me small, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to stop accepting the life that had been chosen for me. I was going to start choosing for myself. I just had no idea how much courage that would require. Grandmother Margaret had always been different, though I didn't understand why until that autumn evening when she finally told me the truth. I'd gone to her cottage after another suffocating dinner at home, where Father had spent 20 minutes explaining to Mother why the new development proposal would be good for the village economy, while Mother nodded and asked if anyone wanted more potatoes. It was the same conversation they'd had 100 times, with the same division of labor. Father doing the thinking, Mother doing the serving. Margaret's cottage sat at the edge of the village, surrounded by a garden that seemed to grow wild on purpose. She'd always been the family rebel, the spinster aunt who'd never married, never had children, never followed the prescribed path. I'd always assumed she was eccentric. That evening, I learned she was revolutionary. "You look like a thundercloud, love," she said when I knocked on her door. "Come in. I'll put the kettle on." Her sitting room was cramped with books. Books on shelves, books stacked on tables, books tucked into every available corner. It was the kind of room that made you want to settle in and disappear for hours. She handed me a cup of tea and settled into her armchair, studying my face with those sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "Tell me what's eating at you," she said. So I did. I told her about Thomas leaving, about the university letters I'd hidden in my drawer, about the council meeting and Mr. Whitmore's patronizing smile. I told her about feeling trapped in a life that felt too small, like wearing clothes that had shrunk in the wash. When I finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she got up and pulled a wooden box from the highest shelf. Inside were photographs, letters, newspaper clippings, pieces of history I'd never seen before. "Your great-grandmother Eleanor," she said, showing me a photograph of a stern-looking woman in a dark dress. She was the village school teacher for 30 years, taught half the county to read and write. Brilliant woman, spoke 3 languages, could do mathematics in her head that would puzzle university professors. I stared at the photograph. I'd never heard this story. What happened to her? The new laws came in 1962, Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral. Said women couldn't hold teaching positions if there were qualified men available. Eleanor was dismissed overnight, replaced by a man with half her education and none of her skill. She spent her remaining years keeping house for her husband and never spoke of teaching again. She showed me another photograph, a group of women holding signs I couldn't quite read. Your grandmother's sister, my mother Catherine. She organized protests when they closed the Women's Reading Circle in 1975, said it was unnecessary when women had husbands to read them the important bits of the newspaper. The photographs kept coming, each one revealing a family history I'd never known existed. Women who'd fought and been silenced, who'd pushed against boundaries and been pushed back. The restrictions I'd accepted as ancient tradition weren't ancient at all. They were recent impositions, carefully constructed to look inevitable. But why didn't anyone tell me? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Because, Margaret said gently, forgetting is how oppression sustains itself. Every generation of women has to rediscover their own strength, because we're never allowed to inherit it. She leaned forward, her eyes fierce. Sometimes, my dear, breaking the rules is the most moral thing you can do. That night, I walked home through the village streets with my mind spinning. Everything looked the same, the familiar cottages, the churchyard with its ancient headstones, the pub with its warm glow spilling onto the pavement. But I saw it all differently now, like a film negative that had suddenly been developed. The pretty picture had a shadow side, and I'd been living in the shadows without even knowing it. The confrontation with my parents came 3 days later. I'd spent the intervening time thinking, planning, trying to find the right words. In the end, there were no right words. I want to go to university, I said over Sunday dinner, the words falling into the quiet room like stones into a pond. Father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Mother's hands stilled on her napkin. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Rebecca, Father said finally, we've discussed this. No, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. You discussed it. You decided. I never got to have a say. Don't take that tone with your father, Mother said automatically, but her voice was uncertain. What tone? The tone of someone who wants a life? Father set down his fork with deliberate care. This isn't how we do things here, Rebecca. This family, this village, we have our ways, our values. Whose values? I asked, because I don't remember being consulted about them. You're being ridiculous, he said, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. You have everything you need here. A home, a family, meaningful work. Meaningful to whom? The words came out sharper than I'd intended. To you? Because it keeps me safely out of the way? Or meaningful to me? Mother was looking between us like she was watching a tennis match, her face pale. I turned to her, desperate for an ally. Mom, I said, don't you remember wanting something more? Before you married Dad, before you settled here, didn't you have dreams? Something flickered across her face, quick as lightning. For a moment, I saw her as she might have been, young, hopeful, full of possibilities. Then the moment passed. I had everything I wanted, she said quietly. A good husband, a lovely home, children to raise. As darkness settled over Millhaven, I found myself thinking about all the women who'd fought for changes they'd never lived to see, all the dreams deferred and voices silenced, and possibilities constrained by systems that mistook tradition for truth. I thought about Margaret, who'd preserved those stories until someone was ready to act on them. I thought about the women in villages across Britain who were asking the same questions we'd asked, challenging the same assumptions we'd challenged, building the same bridges between what was and what could be. The story that began in a kitchen with a cold cup of tea and a moment of recognition had become something larger than any individual narrative. It had become part of the great, ongoing human project of expanding possibilities for flourishing, of refusing to accept that anyone should be diminished by the circumstances of their birth, of insisting that every person deserves the chance to discover and develop their full potential. My daughter will inherit a world where such ideas seem natural and obvious, and if I've learned anything from these 5 years of transformation, it's that ordinary people in ordinary places have extraordinary power to change the world. One conversation, one choice, one act of courage at a time. The voice that shattered silence in a small English village was never really mine alone. It belonged to every woman who'd ever wondered if she might be capable of more than she'd been allowed to attempt. That voice continues to speak, in Millhaven and far beyond, calling others to recognize their own power, to question their own limitations, to believe in their own right to dream and grow and contribute to the great work of building a world where everyone can flourish. The story that began with my recognition continues with theirs. And that continuation, that endless possibility for transformation and growth, is perhaps the most hopeful thing I know.